Making Peace by Austin Fimmano. The rain was falling in ropes so thick that the sun had been blocked out hours before it set. Old houses have a way of trapping the gloom, she thought. It didn't make her sad, but she could feel the walls around her soaking up something more primal and far more ancient than the house and its inhabitant. Though she was attached to the house, it wasn't quite hers yet. It was only a week ago that the stoic front door, impervious to the raging New England winds and 250 years of conflict, had welcomed a young wife and her husband. Only a week's worth of her crumbs had been brushed under the kitchen counters. Only a week's worth of her timid steps had set the hardwood floors groaning. The rooms yawned before her, cavernous. They seemed to be waiting, rather indifferently, for the inevitable parade of dining chairs, leaf tables, Persian rugs, and love seats. And at night, the house belonged to no one. The bright, chilly windows which invited in the light during the day were a void at night. She didn't dare peek out into the darkness, for fear that whatever lay beyond the glass was something unknown. Her husband had laughed at her, but a kind of native superstition held him back too. How strange the stories they told in this place. It was her first night in the house by herself. She floated through the rooms, with their wide entrances and low ceilings and no doors, as if she was being drifted down a current. Sometimes when she held her breath and clutched her arms to her chest, as if trying to make herself smaller, she could feel another life force. It heaved its deep breaths from below the centuries-old foundations. It stirred the bats in the attic and the mice in the walls ever so slightly. Every once in a while it brushed up against her, softly, without thinking, as if it didn't realize how large it was. It was her first night in the house by herself, but she was not alone. Sometimes when she hugged her knees to her body and shut her eyes tight, she could hear the unspoken whispers that hushed up from the earth beneath the house. She shivered. She could feel the reverberations of the phone, still humming on the table where she had left it an hour earlier, against her skin. "You live amongst the dead now," her mother had told her. "They have been there long before you, and they will be there long after. But if you respect them, they'll respect you." They were kind words, simple words. Yet it was the words her mother did not say that loomed above her. The mysterious menace, the beast of the labyrinth. They never spoke of such things, for fear that to name it was to evoke it. If you respect them, they'll respect you. She knew her mother was right. After all, the old woman had lived among ghosts her whole life. There were ghosts hiding in every corner in the corners of every doorway of her house in Texas, curled up like sleeping cats. They were tucked behind pillboxes and hairbrushes and chunks of turquoise in the old dressers, under the overripe fruit in the Mexican bowls in the kitchen, and shuffled between the pages of the news magazine stacks beside the beds. Most of the time they outnumbered the inhabitants of the house itself. But they were young, good-natured, and warm from years of bathing in the red southern sun. Those ghosts were of a much different breed than the dead that slept in the cold New England ground outside her door. She remembered the old traditions from home. She gathered up all the candles that she could find and a box of matches. One candle was lit in each room of the house, the flames echoing whispers of prayers. The last candle she kept for herself. She carried it close to her chest, not minding the stings of the drips of hot wax on her fingers, and seated herself cross-legged in the center of the house. The energy of the place stirred. It picked up its head like a sleeping dragon, yawning, and began to slowly whirl around her, around the whole house, like a great wind. The candle in her hands blazed. She was frozen. She did not know what to do, and the hurricane picked up and up and up until, while visions of the fate of the house of Usher rattled in her mind, there was a deep breath, and all was still. Her candle was still burning, more quietly now. She held her breath. As if delivering a cue, the house exhaled slowly, hugely, a zephyr, and then nothing. The shadows in the empty windows were gone. She blew out the candles, one by one, room by room. She folded them in a napkin stitched by her grandmother, tucked them away, and went to bed.
Photographieren ist nicht gestattet by Jack Ulrich. To the casual observer, it might appear that I was standing in front of an abandoned power plant between Kreuzberg and Friedrichshain, two Berlin neighborhoods that had at one time been the dividing point between East and West Berlin. But this was no ordinary abandoned power plant I was standing in front of. Inside stood one of the most revered spaces to clubgoers across the world, Berghain. Berghain is known for many things, from its debaucherous, anything-goes club knocks, a German word that roughly translates to party lasting from Friday evening until early Monday morning, and strict no photography rule, to the point where they place stickers over the cameras on your phone, to the cavernous main room with 30-meter high ceilings and what is believed by many to be the world's best sound system. But as I stood in front of its massive, GDR-styled walls, the only thing on my mind was what Berghain, above all else, was truly known for: its incredibly strict, oftentimes merciless door policy. Although Berghain isn't the only club in the world with a strict door policy, what makes it so notorious is the fact that nobody except the people running the door actually know what it is. There are rumors about what gets you in, wearing dark clothing, speaking German, and what doesn't, talking in line, being in a large group, being on your phone. But these are pure speculations. The truth, in all honesty, is that there is no guaranteed way to get into Berghain. You just have to be yourself and hope that tonight is your lucky night. I tried to keep all of this in mind as I began walking to the back of what turned out to be a very, very long line. So long, in fact, that it took me almost 10 minutes to get there. When I finally reached it, I checked the time, 12:18 a.m. Luckily for me, I didn't have to dress the part for Berghain. I've worn almost exclusively dark clothing ever since my warehouse party days, as dark clothes wouldn't get ruined by the grime inside the buildings, plus they made it easier to hide from the cops should they happen to show up. I could speak a fair amount of German, ich habe meine Großeltern zu verdanken, and my strong German jawline gave many people the impression that I actually was German. But this wasn't enough to shake the feeling I had in the pit of my stomach that something wasn't right. What if they thought I was trying too hard to look the part? I heard the bouncers can read you like a book. What if they thought my leather jacket and black combat boots were just me putting on so I could get in? Or maybe I was just going a bit crazy because it was freezing outside and I hadn't worn enough layers. I was now locked in fear. The agonizingly slow pace of the line didn't help matters either. I checked the time again, 1:27 a.m. More than an hour had passed and I had made little progress towards the door. I started to think that I was never going to get to the front, that the cold would win out and I would be forced to give up and try again tomorrow. But as I stood there staring at Berghain's imposing facade, I remembered that this was the one place more than anything that I had wanted to visit. I wanted to experience what was talked about by those who have beaten the door policy and been inside. I wanted to see the impossibly high ceilings, hear the impossibly perfect sound system, and I wanted to be part of the impossibly perfect crowd, a crowd that was there not because Berghain was the cool place to be, but because they truly enjoyed the music and the atmosphere there. It was then that I made the conscious decision that no matter how long it would take, I would wait. But just as I had made peace with the fact that I would be waiting for a while, there was a loud commotion in front of me. The crowd that had up until now barely moved began moving quickly to the sides. Before I had a chance to figure out what was going on, I was swept up in a sea of people being forced to the side. Shouts of aus dem Weg, punctuated the loud murmuring of the crowd. Everyone around me was just as confused as I was. There was a collective sense of, what the fuck just happened, in the air. Hoping to break the tension, someone next to me said to no one in particular, "It's like Love Parade all over again." Although this elicited a few chuckles from the people around us. A joke about a stampede responsible for the death of 20 people wasn't the sort of thing you wanted to hear at the moment. Hoping to get some answers, I made my way back towards the center. This time I had better luck. I could make out the source of the shouting, a group of 6 people who were trying to make a path for someone, or something, but I couldn't tell exactly who or what it was. Negotiating my way around the curious onlookers, I moved closer still. It was then that I saw why they were trying to clear a path. Behind the group was a man carrying what looked like a large bag over his shoulder, but upon further inspection I noticed that it wasn't a bag, it was a girl. As I stood there, slowly realizing the gravity of the situation, the group had made it into a clearing and laid the girl down on the ground. She was very clearly unconscious, giving no response to the people trying to wake her. Dead, or just passed out, I wondered, hoping for the best but expecting the worst. An older man stepped forward from the crowd, knelt down beside her, checked her pulse and her breathing, and stood back up. He turned to one of the people who had carried the girl and began speaking to them, and although I was just out of earshot, I could tell by the relaxed look on the doctor's face that the girl wasn't dead. I breathed a sigh of relief. Word spread quickly through the crowd that the girl wasn't dead, which helped ease some of the tension hanging in the air. But then, almost as quickly as the tension simmered, it began to boil again. What had happened to her? Was she drunk? Did she take too many drugs? There was one rumor making its way through the crowd that she had taken drugs from one of the many people hawking their wares. Another one said she drank an entire bottle of whiskey while waiting in line. Meanwhile, as the crowd's speculation continued, the sound of emergency sirens began to slowly fill the air and were getting louder by the second. But it wasn't your usual siren sound. It sounded different, almost like a swarm of massive human-sized bees had been sprayed with an even more massive hose and were now headed right for us. I wasn't the only person who noticed either. The loud murmuring coming from the crowd had quickly died down as more and more people began taking notice as well. Then, just as the sirens reached a fever pitch, a swarm of 10 police cars flew around the street corner next to Berghain, followed by 2 ambulances. The cars pulled up to the curb and the officers began pouring out, surrounding the girl and blocking her off from the crowd and creating a path for the paramedics. An officer stood about 5 feet in front of me, asking people in a calm yet stern voice, "Alle, bitte tretet zurück." When some people didn't move, he repeated his words in English, "Everyone, please stand back." It was a far cry from the sort of police presence I was used to at these kind of events, as cops usually skip the formalities and immediately begin tasing, macing, pepper spraying, and arresting people. While she was being attended to, it occurred to me that I had completely lost track of time. I couldn't tell if a minute or an hour had passed. I looked at my watch, 2:12 a.m. Well, it could be worse, I thought. At least I'm not getting pepper sprayed this time. The situation had calmed down considerably. The tension that had filled the crowd was now largely gone, and as the paramedics loaded the girl onto a stretcher and into an ambulance, everyone assumed that the night would go on as usual. However, this wasn't the case. The crowd had failed to notice something rather important during the commotion. Berghain had stopped letting people in. Whether this was by order from the police or a decision made by the club, nobody had been allowed in for almost an hour. Whatever tension had been relieved by the police presence was now back, only this time it was worse. Some people became visibly angry, upset that their limited time in Berlin was being wasted. Although, ironically, as loud tourists, they weren't likely to get into Berghain anyway. Although I was in the same boat as they were, I decided to keep a more level-headed approach, at least externally anyway. Internally, however, was a different story. I began to worry about whether or not they were canceling tonight's Club Nacht. My thoughts were going back and forth. Would they do that? This is Berlin after all. I'm sure this isn't the first time this has happened. But then again, I've been wrong before. Remember that quiet loft party in Chicago? You never thought that was going to be shut down, and that night ended with you hopping a fence to get away from a K-9 unit. While my mind was at war with itself, I began to notice that many of the people in front of me were deciding to cut their losses and head somewhere else. As more people followed their lead, I began to slowly but surely move closer towards the entrance until, after 3 hours of waiting, I could finally see it. Although they still weren't letting people in, I took this as an auspicious sign. Things were starting to look up. I checked the time, 3:22 a.m. Being inside of the entrance also meant I was finally inside of Berghain's notorious security team, the ones in charge of the door policy. This meant I had to be on my best behavior. No phone, no talking, look like you weren't nervous, and that you've done this many times before. The first 2 were easy, but the last one not so much. The cold Berlin autumn had finally gotten to me, and shivering isn't necessarily indicative of someone exuding confidence. More time passed, but I didn't check my watch. Time was no longer a factor. I was waiting for those doors to reopen, whether to begin letting people in again or to tell us that Berghain was closing for the night. I hadn't come this far and waited this long to not have a definitive answer. The group standing between me and the door, however, didn't share the same resolve and decided to leave. Now, the only thing separating me from Berghain was a massive graffiti-covered door. Then, as I stood there trying to prevent first-degree frostbite from setting in, the door began to open. Out stepped Berghain's most famous bouncer, and possibly the most famous bouncer in the entire world, Sven. Known for his massive facial tattoo and various lip and nose piercings, Sven was the one in charge of Berghain's door policy. He had the ultimate say over who does or doesn't get in, the final barrier before entering the promised land. He stood there, holding a walkie-talkie and paying no attention to me. I tried to put on my best poker face, but inside I was a mess. I looked away from him and back towards the door, waiting for him to say something. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, he received a message over his walkie-talkie. He waited for the message to finish, responded with a, "Yeah, okay," and finally turned his gaze towards me. He gave me the once-over. I stood there, paralyzed from a combination of fear, excitement, and cold. Then he finally spoke. "Detroit?" he asked, pointing to my shirt. I had completely forgotten I was wearing it. I nodded yes in response. He paused, and then, without breaking his gaze, he pointed towards the open door. Have fun.
Innocence and Experience by Dominique Zaugg. Innocence. 2:30 p.m. One new handwritten origami loose leaf note. To hell with balance. I break glasses. I want to burn, even if I break myself. I want to live only for ecstasy. I'm neurotic, perverted, destructive, fiery, dangerous, lava, inflammable, unrestrained. Risks in my memory. I always said I'd turn her into a poem, but she always made one of herself first. When we were 14, driving to school, our first day of freshman year, in the back of her brother's station wagon. She was the girl who had always blown the steam off of experience, so I only felt the first-degree burn. She would have cauterized her taste buds by the time she turned 18. She taste-tested poisons and handpicked her cancer. Then it was just phantom feels, gently throbbing scar tissue. But on that unsullied morning, everything was still shiny and whole. She layered her eyes with mascara, for the first time, 3 coats, and rolled her skirt up one more fold. She mouthed outrageous come-ons to her reflection, wide eyes fixed in their sockets, unfazed. The mirror was posing her, and she allowed it to hold her nymphet figure and color her profile soft chiaroscuro. She saw herself. She was so beautiful. As she clambered in, penny loafers first, humming with energy and slightly aloof, I knew today was not about us, but her and me. I felt deflated for the next 6 hours without my life vest. I had hoped some of that stupid self-satisfaction would have fixed me a contact high, but I was ready to know vicariously the thrill of beginning the best time of our lives. But quite violently, she had become less than intact. In the girls' locker room, where the light was not so familiar, where her own body took on the mass of a dozen other girls, where the mirror was not shrouded with infrequency, she had seen herself. She still held her head crooked with defiance, but her effusive light had suffered. The sermon. Cramped in a matchbox, we have been brought to be read our rights. The same sermon every month, disguised by synonyms and reimagined in parables. For 13 years, I have been clothed, taught, and reprimanded by continuity. First Friday is its culmination, compacted with menace. The world painted from the pulpit is not the same that lies beyond the stained glass. Instinct said so before I was anointed. But these vibrations and sensations are hastily thrown in fire and reek brimstone. They try to inculcate me with a pious beauty, back row seat to hide my prurient kneecaps. Locked in a hot box under a righteous sun, I swelter as they yell obscenities and demand my penitence. Though we are one in the same sacrificial body, I am a threat to you, in that I have not yet forgotten what can be made with these hands, what can be resurrected with a kiss, what can be. Proceed, Father, as I try to understand how I am led astray. Sin with hands. I crush the daisy petals blooming between my legs, my mind. Tabula rasa, bathtub, backseat, fields of wheat. I seek out my God and find her residing within my own body. You want my revelation put in shackles. Pleasure is a gift only received. Sin by the mouth. I taste sweet ambrosia, coating lips carved at the same marble as mine. Color, creed, framework. I taste no dilution. You say the craftsman deals only in dovetailing pairs. Love is a normative noun. Sin with eyes. I see visions of a world of choice, barren and fertile homes, a world where our Savior is not gilded, amethyst encrusted, where he is not even a he. You say that there is a gray, but neither heaven nor earth are made of it. Bright is the only way up. And now the offenses have been tallied. My confessional, written by surrogate, lays ready to be signed. And as chins drop to chests and hands fold, my voice feels as though it has been entombed.
Our hearing closes with a solemnity neither of us fully comprehends in our own ways. Incendiary words, out in a puff of smoke, all our mouths, an ashy aftertaste. 3 months later. The air in his car paints my esophagus like the walls of a chimney. I haven't ingested so much smoke since 4 years ago, when my daddy brought me to the racetracks and got me a seat in the starter car, and I watched from the rear window chestnut-colored horses pull from their lungs as hard as the driver pulled from his cigar. Now I'm in a car again, but this time I'm in the passenger seat watching camels blaze. He offers me one as he adjusts the stereo, but I pluck the one already burning between his lips, afraid I'll fumble over a silver box lighter. It tastes stale and I cough hard, my eyes watering from flying ash and embarrassment. Well done, Ace, he mocks. I always wanted to be called that until he said it. He drives fast, and I remind him we have plenty of time. I remind him that cops park behind the bar on Route 23. He reminds me we're on a tight schedule. We're delivering personalized Thanksgiving food baskets to families with unemployed parents during our chemistry lab. He's a junior with a car, and he can pick anyone to go with him. I knew 2 deliveries in we'd have spare time, just by how hard I gripped the side of the leather seat when he took a curve. His house is 2 blocks from the high school. When we go inside, he walks upstairs without inviting me. There's an invisible leash tied around my waist that eventually forces me to follow. His bedroom walls sag and sigh under the weight of medals, trophies, books. In a room so crafted by artifice and ego, I assume that everything has been staged. A book of poems by the Romantics lays open on his pillow. As I fix a false fascination on some certificate towards the opposite side of the room, I am amazed he does not see me retching. He says, "Let's take a quick nap." He unbuttons my plaid skirt midway through pulling up the duvet cover. He can cut my hip bone in the palm of his hand. "I heard you were one of those," he says before kissing me. The book falls with a slap to the hardwood floor. I choke out, "Let's be friends." Marissa waits by her locker, sitting crisscrossed with a blue raspberry Jolly Rancher clacking between her teeth. I sit down, wrap my arm around her waist, bury my face into her spring curls, and snort laugh. We break out into spasms of giggles. We sit through the final bell. Experience. 3:17 a.m., 1 new voicemail. In the afternoons, when you can see dust dancing, I miss who I was so much I forget what to do with my hands. What is worse than being an adult and witnessing the slow dismantlement of your mental health? Our mothers, everyone. They expect us to function as useful parts of society, yet how is this possible when all I want to do is sit on a bench and try to remind myself how to breathe? Marissa on the dotted line. I always said I'd turn her into a poem, but I will never abuse her like that again. When we are now, 6 years later, and semesters and seas apart, over cigarette breaks and bad cell reception, a chameleon soul by her nature, and a shapeshifter by her own admission, she adorns herself in afterthoughts and good intentions. She was going to be the manic pixie dream girl, his paradise under a fluorescent cross, the girl child in less than a little, his philosophy for the next fortnight. The harlot bathed in smoky blue light, his second to last stop off the interstate. She tries to make herself more beautiful, stitching loose ends with borrowed thread. She reads verse, she knows verse, she is verse. I tell her, "You are not a concept, you are not an antidote." I have spent over half of my life watching her at the loom, counting the pinpricks of blood as they fall. She does not need my help. She does not need my words. Knowing her as being set ablaze and understanding you tons. Knowing her as upsetting your coffee mug and enjoying the burn. Knowing her as sun showers, missed exits, a book so well written you put it down indefinitely because it is too heavy to hold. I've finished trying to turn her into prose. She only translates off of the page. The ritual. And we commence at Bible Black Night, though we only know its time by how diluted the blood pumping to our brains tastes, for there are not stars visible upon which to reckon our chances of warming these bodies against foreign flesh. We baptize this evening in 4-letter words. Our mouths are buckets of water, and our tongues, spitting sprinklers without any clear direction. We purchase extra vowels. It's voodoo. It's voyeuristic. We trade church wine for bathtub juice, secondhand silver and bronze, drain cleaner for our own pipes, and then again for 30 racks, boxes and bags, whatever can be bought off the kindness of strangers. We return our stiff polyester for supple leather, muted grays for warm satin skin. We forsake our chains and medallions for needle guns and liquid velvet, something that better fits our definition of everlasting. We divide cover, dime bags, tablets. We break cab fare in cartons, lukewarm liquor and lukewarm bedmates, having the halves until the only things that are left are crumbs and a metallic aftertaste. We confess to strangers in open air spaces, face to face, rehearse misdeeds we have never felt obliged to atone for. But maybe now that our tongues have warmed up, we let loose words that have a full-bellied ring. We march without ceremony down back alleys and side streets. We form unions on dance floors, front porches, aisles in 7-Eleven. Anywhere that is now, right now, will do. We whisper promises and bellow thirst and wait for our spirits to be exercised.
Monkey Island by Kelsey Watson. The boat was to leave at 6 o'clock. Nasir hated every minute that brought him closer to that time. It was a 40-minute boat ride to Monkey Island. The boat was a clunky old white ferry boat with peeling paint and chip red letters on its bow that spelled, The Lady Mar. Nasir wondered whether or not the ship had lost letters in its name over the years. Lady Mary or Marie made more sense in traditional boat nomenclature. Mar was too mysterious. Was it an old Spanish ocean or a god of war? The Lady Mar left the dock at 6:02, seemingly overindulged in its fare of young people. The engine clanked as it pushed off the dock like an uncle full on turkey and wine on Thanksgiving. Nasir figured that the first half of the boat journey would actually be enjoyable, as some of the nervous gas pain in his stomach relaxed to the movement of the clumsy ship. It was the halfway mark that made him nervous. Though he had never been to a farm party before, Nasir had heard a lot about how they worked. Basically, a bowl is passed around or left at the entrance of a house like a Halloween basket, and everyone throws in whatever prescription drugs they could raid from their medicine cabinets. Once there is a good drunken crowd and a vibrant collection of mystery pills, the bowl is passed around and everyone takes a pill or two. This makes about as much sense to Nasir as Russian roulette. He had heard horror stories, told as comedies, of people puking their entire volume of their stomachs, or the unlucky partier who selects a laxative and spends the night shitting their brains out to the sounds of their laughing, tripping friends. It was all good fun. Nasir was not a particularly social person. He'd only agreed to go to this party because a couple of his friends had worn him down, asking him to go to so many parties that he could no longer turn them down without severing the friendship. It would be silly to lose friends over the cheap cost of self-identity. The more he thought about it, the less relaxed Nasir felt. 20 minutes of self-analysis flew by. "Fuck yes, it's time," Mark said, almost reverently as a pretty blonde started up their aisle with the silver tray. 6:24. "The angel of death is upon us, boys," said Luke. "Let us pray." He got down on his knees in the aisle as the blonde came to the row. Laughing at Luke's piety, the blonde said in a confident voice, "One each, boys," and held the silver tray in front of them. On it was a neat arrangement of white pills, roughly the size and shape of breath mints. Mark and John each theatrically took one, and blonde teasingly placed one on Luke's eagerly outstretched tongue. She was way out of his league. Nasir gave the girl a nervous half-smile and took a pill for himself. "Does anyone know what this is?" Nasir asked, trying not to sound too hesitant. Must be ecstasy," responded Mark. "Better be Molly for what we paid for," John said, referring to the $50 they had each slipped Tracy Newman in the parking lot of the diner the previous Sunday to reserve their spots on the boat. Her older brother had a connection, or was it her cousin? Nasir had never been clear of their relation. "Bottoms up," Mark said as he put the pill in his mouth. Nasir and John followed in suit and dry swallowed the pills. Nasir found the lack of fluid, especially alcohol, disconcerting. The pill had no discernible taste and went down with ease. "It's a waiting game now," Luke said as he relaxed in his seat. "Are we going to start hallucinating?" Nasir asked, trying not to sound too naive and failing. "No, that's LSD," replied John, How do you know that this isn't LSD? Nasir asked. You better hope it's not LSD, because we just swallowed it. LSD is taken under the tongue, like those breath strips, explained John, pretending to be an expert and failing. Sublingual. Don't overthink it, guys, said Luke with his eyes closed. Just let it be. Nasir realized that he was revealing too much about his reservations and decided it was best to stop digging. He sat back and pretended to relax. He began to find the motion of the boat very calming and was nearly asleep when the boat released an ugly toot. 6:45. They had reached Monkey Island. The boat had come up in the rocky crescent-shaped bay very quickly. Nasir couldn't remember seeing a distant rock or any noticeable variation in the sea that would suggest an approaching island before they were nearly in its slender arms of its bay. There was a thin spot on the beach with large jagged rocks that formed the lines of the island. Encroaching on the beach was a tall, dark forest of gnarled oak and evergreens, yet it was reminiscent of a jungle in the southern hemisphere. The atmosphere of the pilgrims had become very somber. Hardly any of the 30 or so teenagers were talking. The only notable sound was a soft coastal breeze and the boat gently making its way to the small wooden pier, which looked like it had been there for 100 years. As the captain, the only crew member lacking any of the expected naval grit and charm, tossed a line to the pier and jumped on to secure the vessel, the pilgrims quickly stood up and made their way towards the gangway. The misty chill in the air made some people cross their arms and bow their heads, making the procession look very somber indeed. For the first time this night, Nasir felt part of the crowd. Where Nasir had expected trash-filled fire pits, a tasteless tiki bar, and a graveyard of Bud Light cans, there was a sandy pebble beach framed with large, jagged rocks. None of the evidence of spoiled use was there. The only debris was of the sea. Nasir's van sank slightly into the damp sand as he and his friends trekked from the pier up the beach. Pebbles speckled with sand turned into more pebbles and sand. Small groups began to form along the beach, a lunchroom defense mechanism. Talk was scarce, and what conversation there was quiet. No one seemed quite sure what to do, but when Nasir looked around, he thought the others felt the same instinct he did. The forest was calling. It was a dense wall of trees and tall shrubbery. Since it was roughly equal deciduous and evergreens, Nasir figured the foliage would be full year-round. There was one discernible opening in the inflection point of the crescent beach, and small congregations were already disappearing into it. Nasir and his friends followed. They walked down the same path, but never found any of the other groups. This is kind of fucked, said Mark. Are you kidding me, said John. 4 guys lost in the woods. This is everything I want from a party. We're not lost, said Nasir. We don't know where we're going, Mark said. Well, we know where we came from, said Luke, and I think it's safe to cross getting laid off the list of destinations at this point. Nasir smiled as he scanned the trees. He was perfectly content with the walk in the woods and felt relieved he no longer had a party to worry about. He wondered if this whole thing had been an elaborate scam. Hopefully the boat would still at least be there when they got back to the beach. Suddenly, Nasir saw a flash of movement in the trees. Guys, did you see that? Nasir said. He looked at his friends. See what? Asked John. I don't know. Something moved over there. Something big. What did it look like? Asked John. I don't know, said Nasir. He looked back into the darkness of the trees. A shadow. It was nothing, said Mark. You're just paranoid. I know I saw something move, said Nasir. He continued to scan the trees. Well, we can't stand here all night. It's getting dark, Mark said. Yeah, let's go, said John. Yeah, we don't want to miss whatever the hell this is, said Luke. The 3 continued down the path, but Nasir kept looking. Another gray flash of movement shot from behind one of the trees. Look, there it is again, Nasir shouted. But his friends didn't hear him. They'd kept walking, and Nasir hadn't noticed because he had just found a thin path into the trees where he had first seen the shadow. It was barely wide enough for one person and cut right through the thorns and branches. Without thinking, Nasir began to follow the footpath, a very uncharacteristic thing to do. The path was dark. Thick trees blocked much of the waning sunlight. There was a damp chill in the shade, and after a few minutes, Nasir was shivering. He followed the winding path over rocks into thickets and through a shallow stream, looking for the shadow. After about an hour and a half, Nasir was cold, wet, and scared. He looked around and realized the path had ended. It had dropped him into a small embankment. Nasir, searching for the path, was not sure how he'd gotten there and started to get anxious. This is what I get for trying to be social, thought Nasir, dying alone in the forest. He sat down on a rock and his arms fell to his sides. Nasir thought about the shadow he had seen. Had he hallucinated it? Was he having a bad trip? He'd forgotten about the pill. Besides questioning his own sanity, Nasir felt perfectly normal. It was just a shadow. Fuck you, said Nasir in the silent woods. Fuck you. "Fuck you," came a voice. Nasir turned around to see gray shadows slipping out in the view of the bank. A dark tail seemed to trail behind it. "Who's there?" shouted Nasir. He ran up the bank after the figure, tripping in the process, skinning his right elbow on a protruding root. On all fours, he made it up the bank and through the trees and bushes into the light. He had entered a clearing. There was a field of thick, clumpy grass that rolled up a small hill. The hill was spotted with birch trees and with bark as white as marble and trunks as straight as columns. With ample and seemingly even spacing, the cropping looked almost haphazardly arranged, like an old cemetery. There was none of the thickets and bushes that cluttered the forest, just green and brown grass. Nasir made his way up the hill into the birchwood. The setting sun cast a golden glow on the birch leaves. They came upon a small clearing at the top of the hill, with a spring in which were several large stones. Perched on one of these stones was a large monkey, his back towards Nasir. Its coat was a shiny black with a large brown spot on his lower back. The monkey turned around, revealing a dark face framed in white fur, like a unibrow and a long goatee. Its eyes were a pale gray. "Hello," said the monkey. "What?" asked Nasir. "Hi, Ola, greetings," replied the monkey. "Are you real?" asked Nasir. "I think," said the monkey. "Therefore am I not?" "This must be a bad trip," said Nasir. "Those bricks." "And you know it's not polite to question someone's existence," said the monkey. What are you?" "I'm the monkey, and this is my island." Nasir stared at him. "My name is Virgil, thanks for asking." "Isn't that a bit cliché?" asked Nasir. "No," said Virgil, "it just is." "Okay. Are you my guide to self-discovery or something?" "That's contradictory." "What?" asked Nasir. "How can you have a guide to self-discovery?" asked Virgil. "Good point," said Nasir. "Then what do you do here?" "I guide," said Virgil. "See?" said Nasir. "Guide to what?" "People, places, and time," said Virgil. "The discovery is your job." "Fucked," said Nadir. "What did they give me?" "Sugar," said Virgil. "What?" asked Nasir. "You know, you ask a lot of questions," said Virgil. "The pill you took was sugar. You know, a placebo." "What? Why?" asked Nasir. "Do you ever stop asking questions and listen?" asked Virgil. "It keeps people loose, yet nervous. The perfect combination for self-discovery." Nasir began to sweat. "So you did this. Why? How?" "It's a long tradition," said Virgil, now sounding bored. "It would all make sense soon." Nasir held the what from escaping his mouth. "There is someone who I want you to see," Virgil continued. "Follow the stream behind me until you find what you're looking for." Nasir noticed a thin stream coming out from the pool next to the rock Virgil was perched on. "I guess this is an I'll know it when you see it kind of thing," Nasir said. "You know, we could have been friends if you could just get over the fact that I'm a talking monkey," said Virgil. "Most visitors don't get to meet me. You're lucky. If this is real, this is the most interesting thing that has ever and will ever happen in my life. If it's fake," Nasir paused. "If this is fake, I guess it doesn't matter." Nasir smiled at Virgil. "Okay, Virgil, I'm in. How far do I follow the stream?" "You'll know it when you see it." "Perfect," said Nasir. "Thank you, Virgil. This has really been something." "Don't mention it, Nasir. I'm a talking monkey. It's what I do," said Virgil. "Are you going to leave me with a riddle or something?" asked Nasir. "Now that would be cliché," said Virgil. They both laughed. "Goodbye, monkey," said Nasir. "I hope we meet again." "Farewell, human," said Virgil. "We won't." Nasir headed down the hill, keeping the small stream to his right. He reached the end of the birch trees and turned back to see if Virgil was still there, but the monkey was gone. Just before he entered the forest again, Nasir heard a call. "Don't do drugs," came Virgil's voice. Nasir smiled and slipped into the bushes into the forest. Nasir followed the stream as the last quarter hour of sunlight washed away. His mind was full of monkey thoughts. Before he knew it, Nasir came to a lake lit up like a Christmas tree by the rising full moon. How big was this island? There was a man with his back turned standing on the bank of the lake. Nasir approached hesitantly. "Hello," said Nasir. The man turned around, but Nasir was still too far away to see his face. "Welcome, Nasir," said the man. Nasir stopped. The voice sounded familiar somehow. He stepped forward. "Grandpa?" he said. "Yes, Nasir, it's me," said his grandfather. "Don't be scared. I just want to talk." Nasir drew a little closer, but he wasn't sure if his legs would carry him any farther. He sat on a rock, and his grandfather, who had died 3 years ago, walked over to him. Nasir said nothing. "You look well, Nasir. You have grown since I left," said his grandfather. "You are a man now." "I wanted to. How do I know you're real?" Nasir cut in. "I don't know, Nasir. Before we talk, I have to know that you are real." His grandfather looked at him with his dark eyes and a well-worn, sleepless face. He smiled. Your elbow is bleeding. Do you feel it?" asked his grandfather. "Yes," said Nasir. He had forgotten about the cut, and now its stung filled his mind. His grandfather took his right hand in his and turned over his arm to inspect the wound. They were his grandfather's hands as he remembered them, wrinkles from age and calloused from work. They were the hands that had taught him so much. They taught him how to fish, how to make naan bread. They were his grandfather's hands, as real as the sting of the scrape. "Grandpa," said Nasir, his eyes swelled. He stood up and hugged him. "How is this real?" "I don't know, Nasir," his grandfather said. "It is this island. I woke up here and the monkey told me to wait." He was kind of strange, even for a talking monkey, Nasir smiled. "I think I'm supposed to discover something," said Nasir, "and I don't know what it is." "That's the point of discovery," said his grandfather. Nasir was frustrated at himself for falling into the trap again. I don't know what to ask you." "You can start with, 'How are you?'" said his grandfather with a smile. Nasir laughed. "How are you, Grandpa?" "I'm well, thanks for asking," he replied. "I feel very well rested." They sat on the rocks of the bank. Nasir told his grandfather how his family was and what people were up to, and his grandfather in turn told him how he was getting on pretty well, all things considered. They talked and laughed for a good hour, exchanging stories and reminiscing. "Listen to me, Nasir," his grandfather cut in. There was no discovery to make, no answer to find. His tone remained light-hearted, though Nasir knew that he was saying something important. He listened. "Life has no certainty. There is no path or arc to follow. I still don't know what I want to do with my life, and I haven't got one anymore." He laughed. "I can't tell you I have no regrets. I made mistakes. But even in the end, I was happy. Not because I felt content or accomplished. I left a lot unfinished. I wanted to watch my grandchildren grow. I was happy because I had chose to be. Happiness is a decision, Nasir. It does not come to you, and you cannot find it. You have to choose it, and once you have it, you can't let it go." Nasir looked at the ground. "How can you stay happy all the time?" Nasir asked. "The world is so fucked up. It feels selfish to be happy all the time. You don't have to ignore the shit in the world to be happy. In fact, you can't. Ignorance is not happiness. Happiness is cherishing the good and taking the shit in stride. The more you face the shit, the better the good will feel. If you're trying to guard yourself from the bad, the good is only blocked." He paused. "I failed with your father. He was a hard worker, which is commendable, but he thinks if he works hard enough, he can protect himself and his family from the bad. Because of this, he misses all the good. You can learn much from your father, but don't fall into the same traps." They sat in silence for a few minutes. Nasir realized how hungry and tired he was. "This has got more philosophical than I intended," his grandfather said. He turned and smiled at Nasir. His face looked even more tired than before. "The point is, Nasir, is that once you can be happy with yourself, the world is yours. Learn from our mistakes. Fix the world. Choose to be happy." "I'll try, Grandpa," said Nasir, returning the smile. "And I'll work on Dad. I don't think he's a lost cause." His grandpa smiled. "You'll do fine." After his grandfather had said he was tired, and they said their goodbyes, Nasir had found a path that took him right back to the beach in a matter of minutes. He was cold and hungry, eager to rejoin his friends and head home. They waved when they saw him. He smiled. Everyone on the boat was happy and relaxed. Little was shared about what each had encountered on the island. Someone found a cooler of beers and passed them around. They drank and talked about light things. As the boat neared home, Nasir sat down next to Luke, who was looking back at the sea. "How's it going, Luke?" Nasir asked. "Good," said Luke. "I found my uncle. He was the funniest guy I'd ever met. Always made people around him laugh. I wanted to be like him. He told me just to make myself laugh and stock the audience with friends." "That's good advice," said Nasir. "Yeah, he then told me that he read that on the back of fortune cookies," said Luke. They both laughed. "Who did you see, Naz?" "An old friend and a prick of a monkey." "What happened to the rest of the monkey?" asked Luke. "Shut up," said Nasir. "How do you know it was a monkey's prick?" Luke asked. "Could have just been some poor bastards." "Good point. You didn't lose anything in the woods, did you, Luke?"